Medical research has given us knowledge and tools to help us diagnose and treat patients. It's given us such things as vaccines against polio, smallpox, measles, rubella, yellow fever, and hepatitis. It's also given us treatments for heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and AIDS, strategies to prevent heart attacks, deadly infections, and birth defects, diagnostic technologies ranging from stethoscopes to MRIs to genetic tests. But part of the problem is that some of this research is going to have a dark past. So today we're going to be talking about clinical trials. These are scientific studies designed to test medical interventions on humans. These trials are supposed to be set up to maximize the objectivity of observations, minimize bias, and avoid errors. All of this is towards the goal of giving us the most reliable conclusions. So typical requirements for scientific clinical trials are control groups, either a placebo or an active control group. It also usually requires blinding, either single-blinded or double-blinded, and randomization. So over the few years, there have been different ethical codes on human research that have been proposed, but there is still a general consensus. Subjects must give their informed voluntary consent to participate. The study must be designed to minimize risks to the subjects and offer an acceptable balance of risks and benefits. The subjects must be selected fairly to avoid exploiting or unjustly excluding them. The subject's privacy should be protected and confidential. The research data must be preserved. And before research is conducted, it must be reviewed and approved by an independent committee. So there are also the main ethical questions around human research are going to be touching on the three main bioethical principles we've been talking about. So the principle of autonomy, the principle of beneficence, and the principle of justice. So some people are concerned that the use of control groups treats subjects merely as a means to an end of scientific knowledge. But this is an exception if the physicians are in a state of equipoise. This means that there's genuine disagreement between the two alternative treatments. The question about using control groups escalates when we're talking about placebo groups. So that means that they're literally not getting anything except for a sugar pill. The most widely accepted view is that placebo control groups are unethical when there's currently another effective treatment available. Most people agree that the subject's informed consent is essential to the research being morally permissible. Nonetheless, there are concerns with certain kinds of patients, whether they can genuinely give informed consent, whether that consent is also voluntary. So specifically, we're going to be thinking about children, the very ill, the mentally disabled, prisoners, minorities, and other people in developing countries. So there's often disagreement about the proper balance of risks and benefits in clinical trials for each one of these groups, these protected groups. So the research subjects in developing countries in particular raise questions about justice. Specifically, should these subjects be given the same medical care that's available in their country, or should they be given the same medical care as the people in the country where the pharmaceutical company is coming from? So we're going to go through a couple of the more recent historical experiments on humans that were really quite obviously unethical. So the Nazi physicians during World War II performed some really horrifying experiments on prisoners of war, civilians, and killing and maiming many of them. In the Nuremberg trials that followed, these doctors were convicted of murder, torture, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. So here are just a few of the experiments that they performed on unwilling victims. So they infected them with cholera, smallpox, typhoid, malaria, and other diseases. They gave them poisons to evaluate the deadly results. They shot them to simulate battle wounds. They froze them to study hypothermia, and they starved them to death. They sterilized and mutilated many others. So These were some of the most horrific experiments that have ever been done on human subjects, or at least in the more recent past. And one of the ethical questions that's raised by these studies is specifically, how do we, use this research now? We've derived the knowledge from these really terrible, experiments, but we now have knowledge. Should we use that knowledge, or is that knowledge and is that research tainted in such a way that we shouldn't be using it? So, whatever you think about that, this wasn't just a problem in Nazi Germany. We also have our own problems here in the United States. So, the U.S. Public Health Services began an experiment in 1932 to study the effects of untreated syphilis in humans. So, this study went on for 40 years until 1972. This was done in Tuskegee, Alabama. So, originally, 600 black men entered the study, 400 of which had syphilis and 200 were the controls. They were originally deceived about the nature of the study, and they were never actually even told that they had syphilis. They were told that they had bad blood, which was a southern euphemism for syphilis. One of the worst parts of this experiment was, even after penicillin was discovered as an effective treatment for syphilis, the subjects were still not treated with it. So it's estimated that at least 100 or 1/4 of the original men died from untreated syphilis lesions. So this is a historical case in the United States, and we're actually going to cover this in the next lecture in a lot more detail. It's even more messed up than that brief description just describes. The Cold War research, this is actually one that I was unaware of before I started prepping for this lecture. But apparently 30 years ago, after World War II, the federal government sponsored state research into the effects that radiation can have on the human body. This research exposed thousands of human subjects, including children, to radiation. They were unknowing of this, they didn't know about it, and sometimes the doses of radiation were extremely dangerous. So the participants never consented, and they were never informed about the potential harm. So in 1956, researchers at Willowbrook State Hospital studied the natural course of hepatitis in institutionalized children. The study had beneficent motives, to better treat the disease and to develop a vaccine. So in those days, most of the children who were admitted to the institution eventually contracted hepatitis, which caused flu-like symptoms, but also provoked an immune response that helped them fight future infections. So the real problem here is that they started intentionally infecting children as they were admitted, partly to give them immunity, but also partly to help them study how the disease spread. This was further complicated by the fact that they were experimenting on children, specifically mentally challenged children in an institution. They had to obtain the parents' consent, but they did not obtain any of the children's consent. So these stories shocked the public and the medical community when they became public. From the Nuremberg trials came the Nuremberg Code, a set of minimal ethical principles meant to govern all scientific experiments involving humans. Since then, other professional groups and governments created their own guidelines and principles for human research, such as the Declaration of Helsinki by the World Medical Association in 1964, or the Belmont Report, a by Congressional Commission in 1979, and the international guidelines established by the World Health Organization and the Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences in 1993. A scientific study designed to test medicine on humans is known as a clinical trial. These studies are done to determine the treatment's effects on the human body. Is it going to be safe or effective? These trials are the best way for us to determine the effects that a treatment is going to have on a body. Neither animal studies nor a physician's informed observations are going to be as reliable as clinical trials. So there are a lot of ways that these trials can be set up, but I'm just going to talk about how these trials are typically set up. First, participants are divided up into at least two groups. Depending on how many treatments you're testing for, you might use more experimental groups. So you have the experimental groups and the control group. So the experimental group or groups are going to get the treatment or treatments that are being evaluated. And the control group, that is going to closely resemble the experimental group, but they are not going to be getting any of the treatments. So You want these two groups to be relevantly similar, so that way you can control for other factors outside of the experiment, like the participants' environments, or their socioeconomic status, or their professions. They use the control as a baseline to compare how the treatment is going to be different from non-treatment. There are two main types of control groups. We have placebo control groups. The subjects in the placebo control group are given an inactive or sham treatment, like a sugar pill or an inert treatment that looks and tastes like the real drug. This is to help account for what's known as the placebo effect. The placebo effect is a common phenomenon in which patients sometimes feel better after receiving treatment, even though the treatment is inactive or fake. So these trials are successful if the treatment shows a significantly greater improvement than the placebo group. In contrast, we have active controlled trials. So this is when there's already an approved or proven treatment. Then the subjects in the control group are not going to be given a placebo, they're going to be given the standard course of treatment. So in these trials, it's a new treatment that's being compared to see if it can outperform or how it compares to others or previous treatments. Generally, placebo-controlled trials are considered more trustworthy. They're going to give us more accurate and reliable data. Still, active controlled trials are effective at teasing apart the differences between two treatments, which one's going to be more effective or which one's going to have less side effects or something like that. To really know which treatments are effective, the patients are not told which group they're in. They're not told whether they are receiving the treatment or they're receiving the placebo. If the subjects were aware that they were receiving the treatment or the placebo, it might skew the results of the trial. The worry is that if they found out that they were on the placebo, that they might change their habits, or they might try and obtain an active treatment, or even drop out of the study altogether. If they know they've received the active treatment, they may experience improvements regardless of whether the treatment works. This is, the placebo effect, but it's working on the experimental people as well. So yeah, even though they're not receiving the placebo effect can still affect them. So the physician's unconscious bias can also skew the results. So to remove the clinician's bias from the trials, it's often double-blinded. So single-blinded means that the patient doesn't know which group they're in, the control or the experimental group. Double-blinded means that the clinician doesn't know whether they're in the control or the placebo group. And I imagine that they use other physicians to help them determine which group is which, and so that way, the person who actually does know who's in which group isn't someone who's actively involved in that research. Or maybe there are other more sophisticated ways of dividing the groups up so that the researchers don't know. So neither the clinician, in a double-blinded study, neither the clinician nor the participant knows whether they are in the experimental group or the controlled group. One way to make sure that we have more reliable data is to have the trials be randomized. This means to randomly assign patients into the control group or the experimental group. This is going to help make sure that these two groups are going to be comparable on the relevant characteristics. So if we were to, theoretically put all the healthier patients in the experimental group and all the sicker patients in the control group, then this would show an inflated effect for the treatment. So to make sure but that's not the true effect. So to get the more accurate and reliable data, we just want to randomly sort people into the control in the experiment, not putting all the healthy people on one side and the sick people on the other side. The effectiveness of a treatment is rarely established through just a single trial. Before researchers are confident in a conclusion about the effectiveness of a treatment, it's usually going to take multiple studies. So by law, drug trials are conducted in 3 stages. So even before these first 3 stages, the drugs have to be tested on animals. So in phase 1, researchers are testing the drugs on a few subjects, testing the safety and monitoring for side effects. This is a stage where they are not testing for the drug's efficacy. And since they're not testing for the drug's efficacy, these trials are considered non-therapeutic. They are not expected to give the patients any benefits. Phase 2 trials, they're going to bring more test subjects in, and they're actually going to start testing for the drug's efficacy at this point. They're still going to be monitoring for side effects and safety. Phase 3 trials, they're going to bring in an even larger group of participants to start testing the drug's effectiveness. and giving it a definitive answer about the treatment's worth. Unlike phase 1, phase 3 trials are therapeutic because they are expected to at least give the patients some benefits. So once the drug has been released and available to the public, sometimes they'll do what's known as a phase 4 trial. This is going to be to test the long-term effects or effectiveness and side effects. So the debate over the moral permissibility of human research subjects has led to a consensus on standards for research. So subjects must give their informed voluntary consent to participate. The study must be designed to minimize the risks of the subjects and offer an acceptable balance of risks and benefits. Even if the subjects give their informed consent, the risk to them must not be unnecessary or excessive. The risk must be offset by potential benefits derived from the research. The subjects must be selected fairly to avoid exploiting or unjustly excluding them. The subject's privacy should be respected and confidentiality of research data must be preserved. Before the research is conducted, it must be reviewed and approved by an independent panel. These are often known as institutional review boards, so IRBs. So there's going to be 3 main bioethical principles that are going to be really important in considering the debate of human research. So first we have autonomy. Again, this is going to be respecting a person as an autonomous agent. Beneficence, this is doing good and avoiding harm to persons. And we have justice, which is treating equals equally. Physicians have a general duty towards beneficence, but at times research seems to be inconsistent with this duty. This is at least partly why they've put it into their ethical codes, specifically that the risks of the subject should be kept low as possible. The potential benefits of the research should outweigh the risks. But further, that we should not be exposing the subjects to extreme risks, even if the benefits could possibly be substantial. In those cases, even a patient's informed consent cannot justify something that's extremely risky. Research should aim to have potential benefits for both the subjects and society as a whole, but the subject's welfare must remain dominant. So there's generally some views that are coalescing around these trials. So the therapeutic trials, again, assuming that the subjects have given their informed consent and there's an acceptable balance of risk and benefits, these trials can be justified by the potential good to the subject and the future patients or society. In contrast, though, non-therapeutic trials, again, assuming informed consent and minimizing risks to the subjects, these can be justified only if there's a significant potential good to society. So it has to have a lot more than just a little bit of good or some good for the patients. Again, non-therapeutic trials they're designed not to have any positive benefits for the patients. So they're going to be justified on how much good they could possibly be giving to society. So the use of control groups in clinical trials means that some people are going to get less than the best available treatment or no treatment at all. Some people think that this means that we are using these people as mere means to an ends. This is the classic Kantian phrase that means that you're not respecting an individual's autonomy because you're treating that person as a mere way to achieve some goal without caring about that subject as an autonomous individual. So Walter Glennon is going to give an argument to defend clinical trials and say that it's not using them as a means to an end. If there is uncertainty about the effectiveness of any of the treatments, a randomized trial is the best way to yield objectively valid results. It will tell the doctor which treatment is better for the patients. So recruiting the patients to be subjects in a randomized controlled trial does not by itself compromise the researcher's duty as a doctor to care for the patients. The better treatment will be determined by the results of the trial. In fact, the patient can benefit more from the research setting than standard clinical care because they receive more attention with the resources available to the research team. Glennon goes on to say, by entering a patient in a randomized controlled trial, a doctor is treating a patient as a means for the sake of generating scientific knowledge. But the doctor is also treating the patient as an end by obtaining their informed consent in the trial and by ensuring that the potential risks are commensurate with the potential benefits. The physician is at once fulfilling its primary duty as a doctor to the patient and a secondary duty as a researcher to the research subject. Yes, we're treating people as a means towards an ends of scientific knowledge, And so yes, in the strictest reading of the means-ends distinction, we are definitely treating them as a means to an end of knowledge. Nonetheless, the clinician can still respect an individual's autonomy by getting their informed consent and making sure that the risks outweigh the benefits. This is making sure that you are using them as a means, not just as a mere means to an end. So the conflict between clinicians and subjects can be framed from the doctor's duty to give the patients the best known treatment. They are obligated to act with the best intent of their patient. Yet, in experimental clinical trials, patients are randomly put into experimental or control groups, which means that researchers are giving at least some of the subjects no treatment at all, the placebos. So some bioethicists are going to argue that it's morally problematic because the researchers are sacrificing the interests of their patients for the sake of knowledge that may go on to benefit society. If the trials are used to determine which treatment is better, then researchers are genuinely in a state of unknowing. They are going to call this equipoise. They have no good reason to prefer one treatment to another. They are rationally balanced between the two alternatives. So some people criticize the idea of equipoise. They're going to think that physicians still have a preference. They think that they still have some belief about which one's better, even if it's just going to be a hunch or a suspicion. And even if they do, they are not in a state of equipoise. And letting the patient then enter and participate in the RCT is going to be wrong. The randomized controlled trial there, sorry. So others think that this is misleading or misunderstanding the notion of equipoise. It's not about uncertainty in a specific physician's mind. Rather, it's more about genuine disagreement among the medical community or the greater scientific community. As long as there is this form of equipoise, then randomized controlled trials are still going to be permissible. Further, without randomized controlled trials, we would never really know if the physician's educated guess was actually right or not. So here we have this quote from Eugene Passamani: "Properly carried out with informed consent, clinical equipoise, and a design adequate to answer the questions posed, randomized controlled trials protect physicians and their patients from therapies that are ineffective or toxic. Physicians and their patients must be clear about the vast gulf between promising and proved therapies. The only way to make this distinction in the face of incomplete knowledge about pathophysiology and treatment mechanisms is to experiment, and this will increasingly involve randomized controlled trials. The alternative, a retreat to older methods, is unacceptable." So there seem to be three things going on with this quote. First, RCTs protect the patients against ineffective treatments. Second, we need to make a clear distinction between promising and proven therapies, and the way to do that is through randomized controlled trials. And third, the alternative of not using the scientific method and only relying on physicians' educated guesses is going to be unacceptable. So other bioethicists are not necessarily concerned with equipoise. They're more concerned with the patient's informed consent. The physician has a strict therapeutic obligation to offer his or her best professional judgment, but also to obtain the patient's informed consent prior to initiating treatment. The latter obligation entails explaining the risks and benefits of all reasonable alternatives, including enrollment in an appropriate randomized controlled trial to test one treatment against another. It gets more complicated when the control group is receiving a placebo. It can be very important for the scientifically reliable results to have a placebo-controlled group, but these studies, the patients in the placebo group are receiving no genuine treatment. So the ethical question is can such deliberate non-treatment really be justified? Many think it's permissible, but only in a specific set of circumstances. So the placebo-controlled trials are permissible if there is currently no widely available treatment, but if there is available treatment, then the control group should be receiving that treatment. Presumably, that treatment was tested against a placebo control. So some argue that if the disease is potentially deadly, then using a placebo control is wrong, even if there is currently no established treatment. So consider the ethical trials, or consider the clinical trials for AZT. This is an AIDS treatment. Promising laboratory tests led to a phase 1 trial to determine the safety of AZT among patients with AIDS. Several of the patients showed clinical improvement during the trial, and because AIDS is considered invariably fatal, many people argued that compassion dictates making it immediately available to all patients with AIDS. However, as required by the federal regulations, the companies used a placebo-controlled trial of AZT to determine its effectiveness on certain groups of patients with AIDS. So a computer randomly assigned some patients to AZT and others to a placebo. For several months, no major differences emerged in effectiveness, but then patients receiving the placebo began to die at significantly higher rates. Of the 137 patients on the placebo, 16 had died. In comparison, of the 145 patients on AZT, only 1 had died. In the view of this research, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board advised terminating the trial. Subjects who had received the placebo in the trial, as promised, were the first ones to receive the drug. So in light of instances like this, most people are going to acknowledge that placebo-controlled trials are permissible even when there is an effective treatment available. But still, these trials should have certain ethical restraints. So patients should never be exposed to undue risk. No research should be done without the patient's informed consent. But also, like in the AZT example, when it becomes apparent that the treatment is clearly working, it becomes unethical to then continue to use the placebo. Informed consent is the action of an autonomous, informed person agreeing to submit to medical treatment or experimentation. Informed consent is usually considered to be a moral prerequisite for any medical intervention. So this is reiterated in the first article of the Nuremberg Code, that voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential. Nothing seems more clear and obvious than the idea that a person should have the right to decide to expose themselves to risks through a clinical trial. So to count as truly informed consent, a patient's decision must be informed by accurate information about the research based on an adequate understanding of it, and it should be made voluntarily and generated without coercion. So there's a pretty standard checklist of the things that must be on the forms that the patients are signing when they're giving their informed consent. That each individual is invited to participate as a subject in the research and the aims and methods of that research, the expected duration of the subject's participation, the benefits that might reasonably be expected to result to the subjects or to others as an outcome of the research, any foreseeable risks or discomforts to the subjects associated with participation in the research, any alternative procedures or courses of treatment that might be as advantageous to the subject as the procedure or treatment being tested, the extent to which confidentiality of records in which the subject is identified will be maintained, the extent of the investigator's responsibility, if any, to provide medical services to the subjects, that therapy will be provided free of charge for specific types of research-related injuries, whether the subject or the subject's family or dependents will be compensated for disabilities or death resulting from such research, that the individual is free to refuse participation and will be free to withdraw from the research at any time without penalty or loss of benefits to which they would otherwise be entitled. So most people are not going to disagree with anything on that checklist. But still, some people are going to be concerned that decisions cannot be fully informed or actually voluntary. So this is going to come from paternalistic grounds. Some physicians think, or at least thought, that medicine was so complex that patients cannot be fully informed. Analogously, some researchers think that science is so complex and jargon-laden that the average person cannot possibly be fully informed. So a lot of people, in response to concerns like that, think that this is just over-exaggerated and a little condescending. The subjects don't need to, understand everything about the clinical study in order to give their informed consent. They only need to comprehend or grasp the most important implications, the risks, or the benefits of the research. So another problem with informed consent is that it's not clear that the subjects who are desperately ill are actually giving voluntary consent. The volunteers may consent to the research out of desperation, fear, wishful thinking, or hope. So they might be acting against their best interest, they might be paying little attention to the information that's been provided, they might be ignoring all the possible risks, they might even be expecting to be cured, or believing that the benefit is highly probable, even though they might be in a non-therapeutic trial, and they've been given written disclosures to the contrary. So even though it is maybe not fully voluntary, they're still giving their their informed consent. But yeah, the problem is here that it's not necessarily voluntary. They feel pressured from outside sources. It really just the circumstances. So informed consent can also be complicated by payments to the test subjects. So the Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences, in collaboration with the World Health Organization, say that subjects may be paid for inconvenience and time spent and should be reimbursed for expenses incurred in connection with their participation in research. They may also receive free medical services. So that seems fine, but it seems to get sketchy when the payments are so large that they start to attract individuals to consent to the trials that they might not otherwise have. So some think that these payments are tantamount to coercion and can undermine voluntary informed consent. So Branch Brody, in contrast, thinks that these rules are overly paternalistic, and he's going to say, if the independent review panel has already concluded that the risk-benefit ratio of the research is acceptable, otherwise the research could not have been approved, how can a large payment harm the subject? And in what way are large payments for acceptable research coercive or exploitative? Moral issues come up with vulnerable populations. For example, children, the mentally disabled, prisoners, minorities, and people in developing countries. The conflict is between the duty to protect the vulnerable groups and the knowledge and the benefits for them and the rest of society. This is noteworthy since the history of experiments were on vulnerable populations. This is, the black men of Tuskegee, the children of Willowbrook, and the prisoners in the Nazi camps. Most people think that research on children is permissible if it's conducted for the children's sake, or if it's done to generate therapies for other children. The trials must have an appropriate ratio of risk to benefits, and they must give the informed consent. But, as they say, the devil is in how those details get spelled out. So in the case of children, it's often the parents or the guardians who give the informed consent on behalf, and they're supposed to be acting on behalf of the child's best interest. As a child matures, they could possibly give their informed consent, but people don't really agree about at what age. Some trials on children require the assent of the child. This is going to be independent of the parent's consent. Other trials allow the child to veto participation. The idea is that, you just really shouldn't be forcing a child to participate in a clinical trial just because the parents have given their informed consent. So other people are going to think that the permissibility of this is going to turn on the risk to benefits to the children. So therapeutic research might be permissible, because it's offering a benefit to the child, whereas non-therapeutic research is a little bit more complicated. Some argue that they should not be permissible because they cannot offer a benefit to the child. This is, by definition. But, for example, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services does permit research that involves children as long as no more than minimal risk to children, provided adequate steps are taken to solicit assent from the children and consent from the parents or guardians, more than minimal risk to the children and the prospect of direct benefit for them, provided A, the benefits justify the risk, B, no better alternative approach exists, and C, adequate steps are taken to solicit assent from the child and consent from the parents or guardians. More than minimal risk to the children and no prospect of direct benefit for them, provided A, the risk is only slightly greater than minimal risk, B, the intervention involves experiences that are comparable to those that the subjects already normally experience, C, the intervention is likely to yield knowledge that is vitally important for understanding or treating the subject's condition, and D, adequate steps are taken to solicit assent from the children and consent from the parents or guardians. So part of the complication around children is that their physiology and pathologies are just different, and so we can't reliably draw conclusions from experiments on adults. Given the necessity of these trials, we need to consider other ethical questions, like how is informed consent going to be handled? Can children give consent? What balance of risk to benefits for children subjects can justify experiments on them? Can non-therapeutic trials ever be morally permissible? And are there limits to the risks that children should be allowed to bear? So many of these same moral issues can be raised with the mentally impaired. For example, this is an adult that is severely mentally impaired or suffers from a psychiatric illness. In either situation, being incompetent, or at least much of the time, to make autonomous choices. So as with children, these trials are necessary to help us develop therapies that could help these patients. Similarly, the research is generally justified if the research is in the subject's best interest, and they also require a surrogate here to be giving informed consent. Also, some think that the non-therapeutic trials are not permissible on the mentally impaired, but others think that this is too restrictive. For example, the NIH in the UK permits studies on the mentally impaired if it involves either minimal risk, greater than minimal risk, but with the prospect of direct benefit to the subject, or greater than minimal risk with no direct benefit to the subject, but with the likelihood of gaining important knowledge about the subject's illness. So what complicates these trials even more is that the population is institutionalized, which generally undermines voluntary informed consent. So this is complicated by the fact that the patients are impaired, or maybe they're only intermittently impaired. But part of the problem is that they are, as institutionalized patients, they're particularly susceptible to many forms of coercion and what's called undue influence. So institutionalized populations have been conditioned to defer to people of authority because they, fear punishment, or less consideration from caretakers for refusing to participate, or because the slightest advantage of being in the clinical trial, maybe they might get special attention, or just the change of routine, or something that might be undue influence in them volunteering for this trial. So these can carry tremendous weight and really undermine someone's voluntariness in these trials. In response, they have set up committees to try and identify and mitigate these undue influences. Still, most people think that research must be continued because the alternative is no research, and that really helps no one. So this ethical dilemma can be illustrated with the clinical trials on HIV-infected pregnant women in African countries. The researchers had already demonstrated that AZT could substantially reduce transmission from HIV from mother to fetus. This is called vertical transmission because it's transmission vertically through the family tree, so from one generation to the next. The problem was that the dose was too expensive for people in poor countries, and they wanted to find out if a lower dose could be effective, hence cheaper. They decided the best way to figure this out was to use a placebo-controlled trial. The trial found that it was less expensive. AZT treatment could effectively stop vertical transmission, so that was a good thing. But it was the fact that they used the placebo-controlled trial. So one of the main objections against this trial was just the use of the non-treatment placebo group. There was already an established effective treatment, but instead they gave these women no treatment, which allowed HIV to be transmitted to their fetuses. So Marcia Angel, the executive editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, compared these trials to the Tuskegee studies because there was a known effective treatment that was withheld from the patients. So she said, only when there is no known effective treatment is it ethical to compare a potential new treatment with a placebo. When effective treatment exists, a placebo may not be used. The point is that they knew that there was an effective treatment before the trial. It was just too expensive for these women. So other people don't think that this is morally problematic, since those in the placebo group were not deprived of a treatment that they would have received under normal circumstances. The idea is that if the trial had not been conducted, then no one would have had access to any of the medication in the first place. Baruch Brody takes this approach, and he claims that an injustice is committed only if the study participants are denied any treatment that should otherwise be available to him or her in light of the practical realities of healthcare resources available in the country in question. The trials in question were probably not unjust. Others argue that if the trial had not been done at all, then even more women would never have received AZT treatment at all. The other ethical problem here is that research exploits vulnerable populations in poor countries to help people in richer countries. Most people think that the knowledge gained from research done in developed countries should help the people in those communities and countries where the experiments were done. Others think that this is totally missing the mark, and we should really just be focusing on helping the research subjects themselves. On a general utilitarian framework, the right actions are those that result in the most beneficial balance of good over bad consequences. So on this view, research on humans can unequivocally be justified. We don't know enough about these diseases or how to treat them, so any study that can add to this knowledge can be justified. Moral justification on utilitarian grounds for clinical studies are just the overall benefits to society. And even though they're justified by the overall benefits to society, you might still think that there should be some moral standards. Baruch Brody says that the experiments should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other means or methods of study, and not random or unnecessary in nature. The experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and emotional suffering and injury. Some utilitarians think that informed consent is required, but others do not. Some think that informed consent would maximize utility, but others think that that is incoherent. In terms of the AZT trials, utilitarians generally argue that they were permissible because using a placebo was the cheapest and fastest way to figure out the best treatment. Others use the Kantian approach that placebo-controlled trials are using subjects as mere means to an end. In other words, you're just using people as things as opposed to persons. This reasoning was implicit in the condemnation of the Nazi medical trials, the Cold War radiation experiments, and the Tuskegee syphilis study. Kant's end means requirements prohibits coercion of research subjects, deceiving them, deliberately harming them, and diminishing or destroying their autonomy. So, as opposed to treating someone as an means to an end, the other way of thinking about it as treating them as an end in themselves. So, treating someone as an end in themselves means that everyone has the same moral worth, that everyone should be treated equally. No one should be treated better or worse unless there's a morally relevant difference. So some Kantians think that individuals in poor countries should receive medical care that is available, not just available in their countries, but available also in the richer countries. Kant insists that we resist utilitarian calculations even if the end is curing humanity's ills. Further, the idea of informed consent comes from the Kantian framework that, respecting a patient's autonomy means letting them freely choose. They need to give their informed consent, and obviously they may withdraw it at any time. And their consent is valid only if the participants are informed, competent, and voluntary. With informed consent, subjects are being used as mere means to an end, but not merely as means to an end. So there's a difference between using someone as a means to an end and using someone as a mere means to an end. And so, think about it's a common example, using the server at the restaurant. You're using them as a means to an end. You're using them as a way of getting your food, right? But you're not using them as merely a way of getting your food like you would with a vending machine. You You can treat a vending machine differently than a person. You don't have to say hello to the vending machine. You don't have to acknowledge who they are. So yeah, this is using informed consent is still maybe using them as a means to an end, but not as a mere means to an end. And the mere means to an end is what Kant is prohibiting. So still on the Kantian framework, informed consent can have its limits for respecting an individual's autonomy. The trials cannot subject them to substantial risks, specifically of reducing their autonomy or death. So Rawls's main principle is the difference principle. This is that societal and economic inequalities are justifiable as long as they work towards everyone's benefits, specifically the least well-off in society. So the difference principle here is going to imply two things. One, that research efforts should be aimed primarily at helping the neediest, and two, that it is impermissible to conduct research on the neediest to provide therapeutic benefit only to those better off. So on this framework, clinical trials on the poor, desperate, or mentally impaired subjects cannot be justified if they're aimed at helping those better off. So in this instance, they have to be aimed at helping those specific subjects. They can't be aimed at helping someone who's, better off. So Rawls would be against research in developing countries that would only benefit people in the developed world. Okay, so today we've been talking about human experimentation. And yeah, so medical science, it's given us a lot of really good things, and it's generally driven by two main values, beneficence, doing good, and knowledge. So, it's the quest for why, that's the knowledge, and then the beneficence, like using that knowledge to help others. But when the subjects of the medical research are humans, these values tend to clash. So one of the main conflicts is between the patients in the study and the patients who might receive the treatment if it's proven effective. To get the knowledge of how effective a treatment is and how to use it well and to do good with that treatment, the experiment can sometimes harm these participants. These experiments can give us knowledge that can transform our understanding of health and sickness, but it also brings up other moral conflicts around how we should treat other people. So yeah, that's not just people in developing countries, it's children, it's the impaired, it's the incarcerated. Yeah, how do we treat other people? How do we, if there are test subjects, how do we use that and use them as, to gain knowledge without, thinking about them as just a subject, as just, a way of getting that knowledge. You need to still respect their autonomy. And so informed consent does that, but, it's also the way you go about treating them when you're there. You want to make sure that you're acknowledging them as people, and you want to, make sure that you are not completely disconnected maybe. But at the same time, research is overwhelming, and if you're studying a disease where people are dying, maybe it's good to disconnect. So, I don't know, maybe there are other ways that you can still be respecting your subject's autonomy while using them as a way to gain knowledge from them. Yeah, so a lot of interesting questions here, and I look forward to talking with you guys about it in class.